Hello, this is Dread, and in today's video topic, this is going to be the top 5 unique items I've ever used. So, if you're new to Last Epoch, you might not know that there is currently a very large amount of unique diversity currently in Last Epoch, and that is mainly thanks to the Legendary Potential system. If you don't know what that is, this means that whenever you drop a unique item, there is a chance that it has legendary potential, which then you can combine that item with an exalted item and steal a few affixes from that item and put it onto the unique item. So if you have like a 2 LP item, you can take 2 affixes and put it on the other item. And that ends up making a lot of the niche and kind of useless uniques and makes them way, way, way better. Like even some random casual unique like the Falcon, for instance, right? Turns into an absolute machine when you get 4 LP on it, because all of a sudden that's just 15% movement speed on your character, and turns out that is very useful. Now, there's a lot of items that are like this, and I've used a lot of them in the past 4 years that I played Last Epoch. So we're going to be talking about a few of them. Now, if you haven't already, I'd heavily suggest leaving a like on the video and subscribing to the channel, as that's the best way of currently supporting me directly. And you can also, of course, join me at my Twitch here. You can watch me live and ask me questions for Last Epoch if you need any help, or if you need any build help. Don't be afraid to come around and with a build planner and ask me some questions and how to help you fix your build. Now, with all that being said, let's go and talk about these uniques, shall we? All right, so the first item we're going to be talking about is Apostate Sanctuary. So, if you are unaware, when this was revealed, it actually had well over 400 flat HP on it instead of that vitality scaling. That was absurdly strong because you could just not cast a spell on a specific mastery, i.e., Blade Dancer and Marksman, and gain a very large amount of HP for free without too much effort. Now, thankfully, the devs realized this mistake and nerfed it, and now they actually buffed its main purpose, which is the ward per second while channeling Rebuke. So, the main idea of this skill is whenever we utilize Rebuke, we are going to lose half of our HP and our current ward, but then while we channel Rebuke, right, we gain 8 ward per second per 1% physical resistance while channeling Rebuke. That is absolutely absurd. Not only is Rebuke a really tanky skill, you can use it to get a lot of DR for free, you also can gain an absurd amount of ward utilizing Apostate Sanctuary. On a lot of different builds, you could very easily get to like 500% physical resistance with a lot of investment, especially on Sentinel in general, right? And that can be like, I think, or like 2000 ward per second. Like there's a lot of different ways you can abuse this item. I think like even 4000 ward per second is possible, and that is a lot of ward per second. Now, the biggest problem is ward in general, right? When you gain a very large amount of it that quickly, you will have to do the ward retention mechanic. If you don't know, the more ward you have, the more ward you lose per second. And of course, gaining more and more ward will make it so we lose more and more ward. So as soon as we stop channeling Rebuke, all that ward that we gained, we're going to lose it. But thankfully, there's a lot of items that synergize with this, like for instance, Frostbite Shackles, which gives us a very large amount of cold resistance to ward retention, which means we can actually gain enough ward retention to make the ward gain from Apostate Sanctuary actually viable, right? Because we can channel Rebuke and then have a very large ward pool for the next few seconds and actually be able to utilize this as all of our EHP instead of having to utilize other sources of like ward or whatever, or other sources of HP. We essentially sacrifice all of our HP in terms of like usefulness, but now we can use Apostate Sanctuary to essentially give us all the ward as possible, and we can use that as our main defensive bulwark. Now, I've used this before. I've used it on a Smelter's Wrath build. Now, on that Smelter's Wrath build, it was kind of a meme, but with Chronostasis. But if you were to use this as simply just a defensive mechanic to gain a bunch of ward very quickly on a normal build and just be really tanky on a build that you can like do damage over a duration, like for instance, Judgment, right? You can essentially sit there casting Rebuke all day and gain a very large amount of ward per second and face tank a lot of boss abilities while also doing damage with something like I said, Judgment, which is great. That means that you can essentially do damage while also sitting there, channeling Apostate Sanctuary. There's a few other builds you could do this with, like for instance, Ravaging Aura. Like there's a lot of different ways of utilizing this. You could use this on like a Manifest Armor build because the Manifest Armor is going to go and do things for you. You don't have to put any like input at all. And all you got to do is just stack a bunch of physical resistance, which is very easy to do for, of course, a Sentinel. So I think this is a very cool item. I think not many people have really put too much thought and effort into it, but it can lead to some very absurd amounts of ward per second on a Sentinel, which I really like. Now, let's talk about the next item, shall we? So the next item on this list is going to be Lament of the Lost Refuge. So when this item was first designed, because if you don't know, this was a community designed unique, they decided to give a void damage spear to, of course, mage. That is very awkward in general. It's a kind of a meme item, but it kind of started clicking with a few people, specifically me. It turns out if you use Flame Rush, and there's a node inside Flame Rush that makes it so that you can have a volcanic orb on top of you. And as you have that volcanic orb on top of you, you will gain stacks of corrupted heraldry, which means you can automate the process of gaining those stacks of corrupted heraldry. And it turns out when you have 160 flat void damage, there's a lot of different ways of abusing it. And of course, the main way I abused it was I just gained a lot of flat melee damage and flat spell damage for my Frostclaw. So if you don't know, there's a node inside Frostclaw that gives you a lot of your melee flat damage as spell damage. So that combined with all the spell void damage I was getting from Lament of the Lost Refuge, that means that I had well over like 300 flat for my Frostclaw. Now, there are other ways of abusing this, and I will be looking into that in the future, but essentially having that large amount of movement speed while also getting that mana regen, there's a lot of different ways you can abuse this spear, and I'm looking to eventually, abuse it in the future. The main way that I want to abuse it in the future is utilizing it with a unique that we haven't used much is Dark Shroud of Cinders. Now, this gives you a very large amount of percent void damage based on your fire auras. This is really cool as we can generate fire auras with it a few different ways, but the main way that we're probably going to end up doing it is playing a Rune Master and using the Winds of Eos Runic Invocation, which means that we can gain a bunch of course, fire auras as we're utilizing our Flame Rush, which will trigger Runic Invocation after we channel Flame Rush for a few seconds. So not only can we get all of this flat spell void damage after using Flame Rush, we also can gain like 200% increased void damage for free. And that starts to actually make things work in terms of damage. Now, the biggest problem with Lament is it's not a spell like wand or whatever, so you can't really get too much crit chance on it. But thankfully, with this patch, they introduce a lot of damage over time spells, specifically stuff like Glyph of Dominion, you have Fire Aura, and stuff like that. And I believe that there's a build there, and I will have to test it. But thankfully, Lemons of the Lost Refuge was a meme that keeps on giving. All right, so the next unique on this list is going to be Howl of the West Wind. Howl of the West Wind is a new unique that was added this patch that makes it so that whenever you hit an enemy with a lightning skill, right? Any lightning skill, it could be lightning swipe, doesn't matter what it is. Your wolves gain additional melee lightning damage based to your melee lightning damage. Now, this can only stack once, thank God, because otherwise that would be broken, because you can get a lot of damage with this. But the idea here is we stack a very large amount of flat lightning on our gear. The reason why I like this unique so much is it makes building a minion build way more interesting and fun than like normal minion builds, because normally you don't get that much base flat for your minions. You can get it here or there, but for the most part you don't get that much base flat. But thankfully with Howl of the West Wind, you can very easily get well over like 100, 120, 140 melee flat lightning if you utilize the right weapons and set up some stuff with some legendary potential on some other items. And that means that you can get a very large amount of flat damage for your wolves, which normally would only have like 20 flat. Now, this is very interesting as, of course, it is the same slot as the other few wolf items, like, for instance, Herald of the Scurry, right? Which, by the way, is bugged right now and is making your squirrels do double the amount of damage that they're supposed to be doing, apparently. That's fun. I knew about this in the back of my mind, but I forgot to, like, bring it up a while ago when we were talking about squirrels, but it doesn't matter. And then, of course, there's also the other unique, and that's Artor's Legacy, which gives you +1 maximum companion. Now, of course, we can't have that with Howl of the West Wind, which is one of the cooler aspects of Last Epoch, is they can balance uniques as well by making it so that they share the same slot as the other powerful unique, kind of like the same dichotomy that we have with like Vessel of Strive, Twisted Heart, and stuff like that. So yeah, Howl of the West Wind, a really fun unique, right? We can utilize it with like really high flat melee lightning damage like items. Like, for instance, I think there's like a Axe Tempest Maw that gives like 40 flat melee lightning, and of course you can get LP on it with even more melee flat lightning. Then you can dual wield these, and that can give you a very large amount of absurd amount of flat lightning. Or you can use Stormbreaker, which gives you a decent amount of melee flat lightning. This would be better if you want to be tankier. Then you could use like a Titan Heart alongside that and get really tanky with the two-handed weapon instead of dual wielding. So if you want to be tanky while also playing this build, you could do that. There's just so many different options, and now every single time they add any amount of melee flat lightning to gear, I'm going to be looking for it for this build, which is cool. So better not give us too much melee flat lightning, sadly, because this item will go insane otherwise. The next item on this list is going to be Wrong Warp. So, not many people are talking about Wrong Warp and how strong it is. Right now, you can cast Teleport or Transplant to stun enemies nearby. Now, normally, that's cool and all, but the main thing we care about is the 35% increased cast speed and movement speed that we have with Wrong Warp. That is a very large amount of movement speed that makes you zoom to the absolute degree. And instead of turning your teleport into like instead of like teleporting or transplanting, right? You're turning it into a buff, which means you can just zoom with movement speed instead of having to use a teleport skill. Now, this is really cool. As of the next line here, it's the 3% increased spell damage per 1% movement speed. So this can get absolutely absurd. You can get like well over 200% movement speed very easily, and that's 600% increased damage on a singular item. Turns out that is very strong. This means that in the end game, you can play a build that is mainly focused around stacking as much movement speed as possible and reaping the benefits for doing so. Because now you don't have to worry about getting percent damage on your gear. You just simply get movement speed, which opens up your options immensely. It makes arbor rings, like the movement speed rings, it makes those into powerhouses. You can run something like the Falcon, like we talked about earlier, and that would give us a lot of percent damage. And of course, we can grab movement speed on the tree, and of course, even the Chrono Warp buff actually gives us a lot of damage as well. And to be honest, this is so strong, in fact, if you get some LP on it, you might not even need to be using teleport or transplant to gain the full benefit from this item. Because of the fact it gives you so much increased spell damage, you could play something like a paladin for like judgment aura or something like that, right? And just gain a bunch of movement speed, right? And then just get a bunch of damage for free while investing into that movement speed, so you don't have to actually invest into LE damage over time on your gear, which means you can invest all of your gear into healing effect on this flat, right? And then get all your percent damage from Wrong Warp. So there's a lot of cool and interesting ways that you can abuse this item, and I really do think that it's one of the best items they've ever designed ever in terms of a chase drop, because not only does it require a very high item level, so you can only slam it in T4 Jurla, you can also like its LP level is really high as well, meaning that of course, if you want LP on it, you're gonna have to grind a bunch of them, which means that there's a chase item that could potentially be very strong. It's also on a very good base as well. So all of this combined leads to saying that this is one of my favorite unique items ever. All right, so if you've been watching the channel for a while now, if you've been watching me for a few years, you will know that my favorite unique of all time by far is going to be the Ghostmaker. Why is that? Well, not only is it a very interesting item with multiple different ways of building around it, it's also just a giant stat stick for damage over time spells. So you are on the Rune Dagger base, which gives you a lot of flat spell damage. So you get 40 for your weapon, and then you get 60 plus necrotic flat damage for your spells, for your damage over time spells. There's a lot of different ways of abusing this. This is 100 flat on a singular item. And that is really good on a one-handed item, right? And with LP potential, we can get percent damage on it and stuff like that. This means that a lot of different damage over time builds, if they have generic damage percent scaling and they don't care about where their flat comes from, that means that they can just put this on instead of having to use like a two-handed staff, and they get to use a shield alongside of it, right? So that's just the main thing with the Ghostmaker. But then, of course, there's the whole entire sub-archetype of Wraith slash Infernal Shade. So not only does it make Infernal Shade into a viable skill, which is really cool because I really like Infernal Shade with the 63% more Infernal Shade damage per active Wraith against bosses and rare enemies. That is like well over like 500% more damage with Infernal Shade. Now it does introduce this weird dichotomy where like your Infernal Shade kind of sucks against like trash, but it's absolutely OP against bosses and stuff like that for the most part. There's a lot of ways of abusing that. So it's really weird to see that dichotomy in real in game, right? Like watching like a spider take a tick, but then like instantly deleting the rare instead because you deal like 500% more damage to it. And of course, we also have casting Infernal Shade on kill whenever you or your wraiths kill an enemy. There's multiple ways of utilizing this. You can either have the node that makes it so that Infernal Shade's attached to your minions, which makes those wraiths deal more like have increased damage. They can also attack faster and move faster and have haste. So that's really cool. So they can buff themselves as they're killing things. So you don't have to actually cast Infernal Shade on them. Or you can do the other way around, where you, on your kill, when you or one of your wraiths kill an enemy, they summon a new wraith, meaning that you get a bunch of wraiths because of that. So both of those combined mean that like you can essentially keep up wraiths while you're clearing without having to cast them too much, and you can keep your Infernal Shade uptime up all the time as well, which is cool. Both of those two things combined means that you can either make a really good wraith build or you can make a really good Infernal Shade build. Now, I focus on the Infernal Shade part of this item, but I haven't actually gotten into, of course, the Wraith part of this item too much. Now, the problem of that is that's because Flame Wraiths are so overpowered right now with Aberrant's Call. It doesn't really even matter for me to mess around with this item because I'm waiting until those those minions are finally nerfed into the ground so we can play a melee Wraith build and not feel like as though we're wasting our time. So until that day, the Wraith side of this item will be defunct until that happens. And of course, on top of all of this, right, there's like 64 ward gained on kill. That is a decent amount of ward gained on kill. You can kill like 10 enemies and get like 600 ward very quickly. There's a lot of different builds that can utilize this. That's really cool as well. I really like that line of text. It's just on top of everything else, right? But yeah, that's going to be it for me for the uniques that I like. These are just uniques I like. Of course, let me know down below what uniques you guys like. Like, what's your favorite unique? Now, with all that being said, this has been Tread. I'll have to go do something else. Bye.